Did you know that when most people think about the destruction of Jerusalem, they think of AD 70? That immediately comes to mind. But it took Rome several years, from 66 AD all the way through the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, all the way through to AD 73 before they were able to completely clean up with the fall of Masada. Stick around, let me tell you about it. So tonight I'm talking about a tale of two cities. And the two cities I'm talking about are specifically a little place called Gamla. I bet you no one in this audience has heard of Gamla. It's a little town up in the northern part of Galilee, up above the Sea of Galilee, that Shelley and I visited when we were there. And it is a stand-in, later on in the talk tonight, for all the cities and all the towns and all the communities that the Romans utterly destroyed. And Gamla, they utterly destroyed it. The neat thing about Gamla is, after the Romans destroyed it, it was forgotten for 2 millennia. Until after the Jewish War, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Jews excavated, I think in 68, I'm not sure when. So you can go back to Gamla today and you can see the way it was back then. Very interesting. City number 2 is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is, whenever we hear about the destruction of Jerusalem, that is the fall of the entire country. We always hear about Jerusalem falling in AD 70. Well, yes, it did. But it was a process starting in AD 66, going all the way up through AD 73, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on tonight. Now, what we've done this morning is build the city of Jerusalem. What we've done this evening up to this point is build the Temple Mount. And now we're going to talk about tearing it all down. And again, I mentioned to you, we're talking about two different cities. Gamla, up in the Galilee region. You have to go past the burned out Syrian tank. There literally is a burned out Syrian tank on the way up to Gamla. And I was going to take a picture of it when I came back down that way, but we ended up going home a different way, or back to Jerusalem a different way. Not to Jerusalem, but Tiberias. But anyway, Gamla is a stand-in for all the little towns and communities that the Romans completely destroyed in their lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem itself. And then, of course, we have Jerusalem that we're going to talk about in quite a bit of detail. From the birth of Jesus until the destruction of Jerusalem, there were three main groups of people that were in charge. The Herodians, of course, Herod the Great, his sons, grandsons, etc. The Prefects, and the Procurators. The Prefects, the most famous of those is Pontius Pilate. If you're a Christian, we're very familiar with Pontius Pilate and his role in what he did with the crucifixion of Jesus, right? If you're a Bible student, the most famous of the Procurators, Felix and Festus, right? Because we see their interactions with Paul, the apostle, for example. Okay, Felix and Festus. If you're a historian, if you're interested in the destruction of Jerusalem, the most famous of the Procurators is probably Gessius Florus, who ruled from AD 64 to AD 66. We'll talk about him in a minute. He was a bad guy. This chart, I know you can't see. I've got a poster of it back there if you're interested in the details. But across the top of this poster are the different regions. 9 different regions, 8 of which we're mostly interested in: Judea, Samaria, Idumea, etc. Herod the Great ruled all these regions from 37 BC when he conquered Jerusalem to 4 BC when he died. When he died, the regions were broken up among his 3 sons. Herod Archelaus took the main regions: Judea, Samaria, Idumea. His son Philip took these regions, and his son Antipas took these regions. Herod Archelaus was a bad dude. He was so bad that the Jews actually convinced the Roman Emperor Augustus to depose him, and he was banished in AD 6. And what the Romans decided to do in AD 6 was combine these 3 regions, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, into one region, a Syrian province called Iudea. Has anyone ever heard of Iudea? Or Judaea? That's our pronunciation today. Judaea was a combination of these 3 regions into one: Judea, Iudea. They also put prefects in charge. As we mentioned, Pontius Pilate was the most famous of the prefects. As time went on and these sons died out or they were deposed or whatever, There's a little brief history there when it was added to the Syrian province. But Herod Agrippa the first came along, the grandson of Herod the Great. And he took over, first of all, took over these three regions in AD 37. He added these regions in 39. And then he finally added these final three regions, or one, Iudea, in AD 41. So Herod Agrippa I ruled all the same regions that his grandfather had ruled, Herod the Great had ruled. That's kind of cool. But of course, everybody dies. So Herod Agrippa I died in AD 44. When he died, the Romans decided to put the procurators in charge of all the regions. Again, the most famous that we know, Felix Festus, Gessius Florus, I'm going to talk to you about tonight, and Albinus. We'll also talk about him. So when they put him in charge, these people in charge of these regions, they were in charge of all the regions until a man named Herod Agrippa II came along, the great-grandson of Herod the Great, and he took over kind of stepwise like his father had done. He took over these regions in 53. He took over this region in 54 and part of this region in 54, but he never took over Iudea. If he had, Jerusalem probably would have never fallen. The Jews would not have had an excuse to go to war against Rome. If he had, he was very good to the Jews, and the Jews would have been okay with Roman rule, probably. But the Romans chose not to put that Iudea under Herod Agrippa II. If they had, things would have been way different. We might be able to go see the temple today. We might be able to go to the Temple Mount and stand outside the Soreg and look inside the temple grounds. But because they didn't put him in charge and they put the procurators in charge, Rome came in and crushed Jerusalem later. Now, I encourage you, I know there's a lot of detail here that you cannot see. I encourage you to go back there and look at the chart. If you're interested in this kind of thing, go back and look at the poster that I have back there. So the history leading up to the fall of Jerusalem is this. We had Felix and Albinus, two fairly evil people. Felix had a high priest, Jonathan, killed, and he had a bunch of Jews killed. Felix wasn't allowed to do that, even though he's a procurator. If Herod Agrippa had wanted to kill the priest, that would have been okay. You know, that's not fine, because the priest was appointed by, at that time, Herod Agrippa. In my book, I've got a table of all the high priests in the back in one of the appendices, and I have a listing of who appointed that particular high priest. Well, at this particular time, Herod Agrippa was in charge of appointing the high priest. So he could depose, he could kill, he could do whatever he wanted to do to the high priest, but the procurator was not allowed to do that. But he did. He killed Jonathan. He killed a bunch of Jews in Caesarea. He was just kind of a bad guy. We do know about him in the Bible. And he's the one that kind of kept putting Paul off. Albinus was the next bad dude. Josephus tells us, tremendous historian, interesting historian, very interesting life. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Josephus tells us there was not any sort of wickedness that could be named that Albinus had a hand in. He was bad. He executed all the prisoners who were bad, who had done serious crimes, and he let everybody else out of prison who would give him money. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on, cycles of history. Some of this is going on today in the U.S. Some of this lacks on criminal stuff going on in some of these bigger cities. Some of that's going on today. The more things change, the more things that stay the same. So, those two procurators, bad guys. Next up, Gessius Florus. He was so bad that the Jews considered Albinus a good guy compared to Florus. He brought on Judea an abundance of miseries and did his utmost notions to the harm of the nation after a pompous manner. He stole 17 talents from the temple. How much is 17 talents? Does anybody know? No, I bet nobody knows. Well, you go on my website and you can punch it in and you can see how much 17 talents is. When I punch it in my website, it comes out about $9 million. And I explain my methodology of how I come up with that number. And you can agree with that or not agree with that. You can plug in different numbers and change that if you want. But it was millions of dollars, for sure. Could be $5 million, could be $20 million, I don't know. But I do explain the methodology that I use. And the methodology that I use, it was $9 million. A lot of money. There was a massive crime wave under his watch. He was so bad the Jews considered Albinus a good guy. Even Bernice, the sister of Agrippa II, petitioned Florus, and she was afraid for her life. The sister of the king was afraid for her life because of this man, this evil man, Gessius Florus. He wanted the Jews to go to war. And the reason was that all the bad things that he did, well, if you're in a war, you kind of don't think about the bad things that he did, right? You got really more immediate things. You got to kill the Roman that's in front of you, but without worrying about that he stole 17 talents of money back here. We don't care because we got a war to fight. So he wanted the Jews to go to war with the Romans, and he got his wish. The Jews ended up fighting amongst themselves. The Jews and the Romans were fighting. The Syrians and the Jews were fighting, and it was a mess. Every city was divided into two armies, and it talks about the dead men in the street, the old men, mixed in with the babies, mixed with infants, all dead. Things were so bad that Rome finally called in a man named Cassius Gallus in AD 66. Gallus was a Syrian governor at the time. I know you can't read this, probably, but I've enhanced a couple of these bullets at the bottom. So when the Romans went and took all of Judaea, Iodea, their main base of operations was here in Caesarea. So every chart that I show, you'll see them fanning out from Caesarea and going and doing their Roman things. Gallus was no different. He started out in Caesarea, took some cities here and there, and then came down to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then for unknown reasons, I've not found any reasons in the literature, for some unknown reason in AD 66 in October, he broke off the siege. Weird. But the Jews said, ha ha, we have him now. Oh, I can see the Star Wars analogy, we have him now. And the Jews went out and attacked Gallus, and they pursued him and destroyed much of his army. My question is, what if Gallus had succeeded in AD 66? The temple would probably still be there. Probably 1 million Jews' lives would have been saved. As much as that, as awful as that is, if he had killed a bunch now, it probably would have saved another 1 million later on if he had succeeded. But he didn't. He broke it off, and then Vespasian, the very famous Roman general and soon-to-be emperor, was appointed to take over the destruction of the region. In AD 67, Vespasian took over, and again, starting in Caesarea over here on the coast, he started going out. Most of this, he did a couple of cities, 3 cities down on the coast, but most of his activity was up here in the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. We're interested in Gamla. Gamla is in the very tippy top of the Sea of Galilee, and you can drive up there today, and we did. We actually went up there and we stopped to kind of look out over it's a higher level, the Golan Heights, right? Golan Heights is a higher level. So we stopped under a tree to look out over the Sea of Galilee and the hills and stuff, which is pretty cool. And I looked down, and you didn't expect to see a picture of gravel, right? So I looked down and I thought, I'm going to take a picture of that gravel. That's kind of cool. Well, that's not gravel. We were parked under an olive tree. Gamla was known for its very high quality olive oil. And there's olive trees all over the place up there. We had stopped under an olive tree to get a little shade and a little rest. So Gamla sat on a hill that looked like the back of a camel. See the back of the camel there? In fact, Gamla, it means camel, or camel's hump, Gamal in Hebrew. This area where I'm standing here, where I took this picture, I put the page numbers in the book, by the way, if you have a book, if you want to look. I'm standing at the place where Vespasian likely stood when he was surveying Gamla. This is a recreation of one of the implements of war that the Romans used to take Gamla. Gamla was built such that the porch of one house was the roof of the next house, and the porch of this house was the roof of the next house, because all everything was built on this slope here. When the Jews were there in Gamla and the Romans came in to take over, all these houses started collapsing. The weight of the Roman soldiers climbing up, they just started collapsing, one on top of the other, just one right after the other. And so many people were killed because of the collapsing of these roofs. Well, Gamla really is just a stand-in for what the Romans did everywhere in Iodea. They just destroyed everything. So when we think about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's not just the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of a bunch of other people, killing a bunch of other people, taking a bunch of other people as slaves. It was bad, and they were very methodical. Vespasian was very methodical about it. Gamla was set up by a man named Josephus to be the main stronghold of the Golan Heights of the Galilee. Josephus was a Jewish commander of the Galilee. Now, you've probably heard the name Josephus in your studies or whatever, in talks, sermons, whatever. So Josephus was first a commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee, and he transformed into eventually the spokesman for the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem. I don't have time to tell you that story tonight, but it's an interesting story, how he transformed from a Jewish general, commander, to a Roman spokesman when Jerusalem fell. Rome's campaign of AD 68, Vespasian, again starting in Caesarea. He pretty much covered all the Galilee at this point, so he started working south, started taking cities south. Notice he's not going to Jerusalem yet, because Jerusalem right here, because he's working, taking the countryside. Again, when you think of the destruction of Jerusalem, you think the Roman armies came in, they took Jerusalem, everybody went home. That's not the case at all. They took everything first, and then they took Jerusalem last in AD 70. AD 69, you see the activity is lessening now because he's not quite ready to take Jerusalem. That's going to happen the next year. But Vespasian ended up becoming emperor in 69 AD. It's called the Year of the Four Emperors. Ask me how it went for the first three of those four emperors. It didn't go so well. But Vespasian came along, number 4 of those 4 emperors, and he established the dynasty that lasted for quite a few years after that. He ruled for many, many years. So Vespasian became emperor. He left his son Titus to clean up and finally take Jerusalem. In AD 70, that's what he did. Titus brought along 4 regions, the 5th, the 10th, the 12th, the 15th. There were a bunch of Jews in Jerusalem for Passover at the time. He brought his legions from various places, camped them outside Jerusalem, and they started their work. This is what the Romans did. I mean, if you have a job description of the Romans, that's what they did. They took cities. Jerusalem was no different. Josephus became the chief negotiator with the Jews. It was very personal to him. His wife was in Jerusalem. His mother was in Jerusalem. I'm sure many members of his family were in Jerusalem. He would go outside the walls in Jerusalem and he'd plead with them and say, please, this is not going to end well with you. And it wasn't because the people were saying, oh, well, we don't care. We're going to fight the Romans anyway. We don't care if we're killed. They weren't saying that. It was the zealots that were saying that. I could spend an entire lesson just on the zealots. Because of them, Jerusalem fell from within before the Romans even stepped foot in the city. There were different factions of zealots fighting each other. John of Giscala, Eleazar was another one. Simon was another one. So these factions of zealots were fighting each other, but they had one common goal when it came to the people of Jerusalem. We don't care about the people of Jerusalem. They would steal their food and eat their food, and they would kill people who didn't want to be killed and let people live who wanted to be killed. They were just not nice people. It was so bad that a woman boiled her child, her baby, and ate that baby. They were scavenging in the sewers and stuff for food. Things were bad in Jerusalem because of the zealots. The zealots would not let people leave Jerusalem. Even if you said, okay, Rome, I'll be a slave. You know, take me off of the salt mines or whatever. I don't care. I don't want to go through this, whatever. Well, the zealots wouldn't let them. So Jerusalem fell from within before the Romans even set foot in. The destruction of Jerusalem, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, as I mentioned before, the same day that the temple fell in 587 with Nebuchadnezzar. Order of events. Now we covered the city of Jerusalem, all these walls, the first wall, the second wall, the third wall. So the third wall was the outer wall at this time. So the third wall was the first wall breached. This is Josephus' terminology. If you go and read his description of the destruction of Jerusalem. So this was first of all breached. They took the new cities. And these are where the legions camped. The 5th, 12th, 15th. Their second camp, they were out here first, and then they moved into the city after they breached the walls. And then the 10th Legion was out here. Next up, they breached the second wall. They then did a couple of unsuccessful attacks on the Antonia fortress and on the first wall, and they were rebuffed. So the Romans said, that's okay. Let's step back for a minute and let's build a siege wall around the city of the part they didn't control. This was really twofold. This was to keep people in and keep people out. Enforcements couldn't come and bring food or whatever, And people that wanted to escape, even if the zealots let them escape, they couldn't escape because of the siege wall. So that kept people in. Anyone that tried to cross a siege wall would be killed by the Romans. Okay. Next up, the Antonia fortress was taken. Once they took the Antonia fortress, it was pretty easy to go and take the Temple Mount. Once they had the Temple Mount, it was pretty easy to go take the lower city. Now remember, height is everything in military battles. So the higher you are, you can rain down your arrows and whatever on the people below, particularly if they're people in Jerusalem that didn't have as many defenses as the Romans had offenses. So it was pretty easy to, this order of, once they got the Antonia fortress, it's pretty easy to take the Temple Mount and then the lower city. And then next up, they took the upper city by breaching, coming from the Temple Mount, and then the first wall. This is what it looks like today. You can remember this morning I talked about the burnt chamber. That's something I recently found is from the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. This is the burnt house. It's different. You go about 30 feet underground and see this house that's actually the remains of a house that was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. It's the only place that they found the remains of a person. They found the remains of a forearm of a woman that had been killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. This house was a rich person's house. It was a priest by the name of Catastrophic, I believe. But this person was a priest in Jerusalem, and his daughter, I guess, they said she was maybe 25, 28 years old or something like that. Her forearm was found, so the destruction was pretty brutal. They found a spear in the house, a Roman spear, and of course we talked about the destruction on top of the Temple Mount that they pushed the stones over the wall. You remember the shops on the lower side of on the southern wall of the Temple Mount I talked about? I said, remember this as we go? This is the southern wall. These are the arches that used to be a shop. You can see the intensity of the fire that burned in Jerusalem when they burned all these shops. Can you see that arch there? There's another one here. And of course, to the victor of the spoils. I meant to get it and bring it up here, but I forgot before coming up here tonight. But I have Tyrian shekels. Tyrian shekels were required by the temple priest for payment of the temple tax. Every Jewish male who was 20 years old and older had to pay the temple tax. And they required Tyrian shekels because they were very pure, like 90% pure silver. And they were consistently pure. When they minted shekels, they were always 90% silver. So the priest required that to be paid for the temple. That's why you had the money changers. People didn't carry around Tyrian shekels with them. They had pruta, they had denarii, they had grams from the Greeks. They had all this different kinds of money. Money is a really complex subject. I started to write a little section on money and ended up writing a whole chapter on money. So they had all this money, and that's what the purpose of the money changers was. And I think Jesus' problem with them was that they were charging people just outrageous prices for converting this money. But it was actually a valid function that they were doing. So anyway, I digress. So Tyrian shekels I meant to bring up here, but please go back and see the Tyrian shekels. They're very rare. You don't see many Tyrian shekels today. I have a full shekel and I have a half shekel. A half shekel is required of the temple tax for every Jewish male above age of 20. Now, the temple, when the Romans took it, probably had millions of these Tyrian shekels in there. I mean, they've been gathering temple tax for decades and hundreds of years, you know, bringing this money in. What are they doing with it? Well, they're storing it in the temple. They didn't have banks back then. You're storing it in the temple. So when the Jews came in and took the temple, they took all these Tyrian shekels, these pure, 90% pure Tyrian shekels, and they melted them down and turned them into denarii. And denarii, what was the Roman currency? They used denarii to pay their soldiers. They used denarii to build the Colosseum in Jerusalem. They used denarii to build the Arch of Titus in, not Jerusalem, but in Rome. The Jews built the Colosseum in which they were later put to death. Same with Christians. They would be mocked in gladiator games. They would be torn apart by wild animals. There were so many different ways that they killed Jews and Christians in the Colosseum. Well, who built that Colosseum? Well, the Jews built it from their Tyrian shekels that were melted down into denarii. I have Tyrian shekels back there. I also have denarii. You can see the difference in those. The Arch of Titus, we see a relief inside the Arch of Titus. See right there is the menorah, the 7-branch candlestick. That's the Roman soldiers carrying off the implements of the temple when they destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. Rome's campaign of AD 71 through 73 was basically a mop-up operation. They took several fortresses, Herodium, Machaerus, Masada. I wish I had time. I could talk a whole lesson on the fall of Masada. Some of you are probably familiar with it. There's been a bunch of movies written about it because it's really a fascinating story. That the Jews, 960 some odd Jews, killed themselves instead of being allowed to be taken slavery, captive, or killed by the Romans. They killed themselves. Interesting story. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, go to Masada today and say, never again. That's one of their stands where they get their pins or whatever, I don't know. But they say, never again. They say that on Masada. We're not going to let that happen again. And they don't. They're very, very good with their defense. So anyway, mop-up operations, AD 71 to 73. And now I want to talk about some cycles in history. So this morning we talked about a cycle of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, that cycle. We talked about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, we talked about the good men of the Maccabees, and then it's led into the weak men of the Hasmoneans, and of course Salome Alexander was actually pretty good. And then of course the weak men, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, both appealed to Rome for helping their civil war against each other, two brothers, one a Pharisee, one a Sadducee, as we talked about this morning. And Rome came in and took over, and we went back to hard times in AD 63 when Pompey took over. Next up, we see cycles in the Old Testament. My best example is the book of Judges. In Judges, we see a cycle of sin, and then God allowed them to serve the nations around them, and then they repented. And then a judge came along, and they were given salvation, and they had a period of rest until, guess what, they sinned again. And the cycle started over again and over again and over again, all the way down. That's the Old Testament. In modern days, we have something called the Tytler cycle of civilizations. This is interesting and terrifying. And I'll tell you why it's terrifying. When you talk about cycles in history, you can have very small cycles. We can have just a cycle tonight. I can have a bad time, I could trip and fall out there or something, and then I get better, and really what I'm saying. But you can also have very big cycles. So you have smaller cycles and side cycles and side cycles. But if you look at the history of the United States, we were under bondage to England, right? Taxation without representation, all this kind of stuff. And along came some very brave men who had faith, and they had courage, and they were willing to fight for their beliefs. George Washington, all of our founding fathers, they were there to fight for their beliefs. And then we get liberty, good times, and then we get abundance, right? Good times. And then our focus turns to material things, unfortunately, selfishness, self-absorption, complaining. My phone, that's the only thing I'm interested in. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care about anything but my phone. I got to check my text message. I got to check my email. I got to see what this website's doing, what Taylor Swift is up to, whatever it happens to be. Selfishness, complacency, apathy. Let somebody else do it. Something bad's going on. Let somebody else take care of it. That leads to dependence and then leads back to bondage. And that's the point of no return. That's the point at which no systemic change can help. It's going to take brave men or brave women to come along and break that cycle of bondage. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of this cycle. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, etc., all the way down. Now, a lot of these places still exist, like Rome still exists, but the Roman Empire does not. The British still exist. They're some of my favorite people. I did a lot of international traveling and training of people. The Brits are some of my favorite people to talk to when I did that. They still exist as a nation. They still exist as London is a city. You've been there just a while back. Been to London a couple of times, and it still exists, but it's no longer an empire. But their empire started crumbling around 1947 to 50, where India went independent. their currency started being, we were on a reserve currency of the pound sterling back in the mid-20th century. But the dollar supplanted that. Remember, there was this agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia that if you'll price your oil in dollars, we will protect you. And by that agreement, we became the reserve currency of the world. And because of our deep bond market and that kind of thing, we have continued to be the reserve currency of the world. And the British pound sterling still exists, but it's not a reserve currency anymore. That's a pretty important thing. I don't know how many of you in here are economists or whatever, but that's a pretty important thing. So all these average together, 238 years. We are 248 years and counting. Is that scary to anyone? So the question is our time coming? Where are we in the cycle today? We've had some hard times in our life, right? World War II, the attack on the World Trade Center, the Cold War, the Depression. We've had some strong men. I put a Democrat up here and a Republican up here so no one could yell at me afterwards. Fair and balanced, I guess. Good times. My question is, have they come and gone? Are we at the end of the good times? Weak men and weak women. We see a lot of things going on, anti-Christian movements. We see a lot of anti-Semitism going on. We see a lot of abortion, for example. You know, there's some advocate for abortion up until the 9th month and even after the baby is delivered that we've seen in the news. Weakly enforced laws. We see the promotion of dozens and dozens of genders and pronouns and things like that. Are we looking at weak men or women leading us to hard times again? Are we in for a recession? Are we in for a war? Are we in for whatever? A terrorist attack, Christian persecution? I don't know. Possibly. Possibly. Why do we think we're immune to this kind of thing? We're just another cog in the wheels of history, right? Abraham Lincoln said this pretty cool. He said, "Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up against us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." Abraham Lincoln was a pretty smart guy. My question is, where are we in the cycle today? If we study history just because it's interesting, we have lost the purpose and missed the point. Now, I'm a historian. I mean, I'm not by training, but I'm a historian because of my hobby. But if I study just because it's interesting, we've lost the purpose. As someone once said, history may not repeat, but it often rhymes. This morning's lesson was about personal character. We looked at the Pharisees and how they compared to us. Tonight's lesson has been about national character. And we looked at some specific men, Albinus, Felix, Festus, and we've seen how these men's character affected the national character of their time. I strongly believe, I hope you do too, that we must latch on to the national character on which our nation was founded, the Judeo-Christian beliefs and principles. I am concerned that we may be in for a jarring rhyme of history if we don't. But it starts with us. The character of a nation's people makes the character of the nation. But if we're selfish, like these men we studied tonight, Albinus, Felix, and they're just in it for the money, they're just in it for the fame, they're in it for the power, whatever, if we're selfish like these people, then we're doing our little part to contribute to the national downward cycles. Selfishness destroys lives. Selfishness destroys relationships. Selfishness will destroy the nation if we let it. But it all starts with us. We've seen it tonight. We've seen what can happen. History does repeat. It certainly rhymes. We're living it now. My opinion, we need to turn it around. There's nothing special about the U.S. as far as history goes. It doesn't care. But we need to be a people of character and build up the nation into a nation of character.